Would you ask Dame Melanie to come back in, please? Thank you. Right, Dame Melanie, ready to carry on? Yes. Thank you. Yes, Mr.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. 3:30, 15th of June, ministerial cross-Whitehall meeting, second of its kind. Now, you didn't attend, did you?
No.
But your colleagues, Helen Mcnamara and Catherine Richardson did, I think.
Yes.
And is it right that Helen Mcnamara spoke to you after the meeting to relay the concerns that had emerged?
Yes.
Do you remember the conversation?
Not particularly, but I do remember, in general terms, discussing with Helen that afternoon all of the various different worries that were beginning to come through and that had crystallised in the meeting, as I was saying earlier.
Right. Now let's go to CLG 3030440, which is Helen Mcnamara's first witness statement. Page 5, please, paragraph 28. And I just want to show you paragraphs 28 and 29 on page 5. She says, immediately following the meeting, this is paragraph 28, whilst I remained in the meeting room, I spoke to Lorna Grattan, the Prime Minister's private secretary. She explained that there were ministerial concerns about the organisation of the local relief effort and that the Prime Minister herself was concerned. I discussed these concerns with Melanie Dawes and explained my view that the department needed to put greater pressure on RBKC to accept offers of support. I understand that Catherine Richardson, who was present during my discussion with Lorna Grattan, discussed it with Joe Farrer. I also emailed Joe Farrer directly in the knowledge that she was due to accompany Sajid Javid and Alok Sharma on a ministerial visit on the Friday morning. Now, so far as that is an account of her conversation with you, does it accord with your recollection?
Yes.
Now, if we look at Catherine Richardson's statement, that's at CLG 3030412. I'll show you the first page to identify the document. This is her witness statement to the inquiry of the 15th of March 2019. And if we go, please, to page 21, paragraph 77, she says this. I attended the cross-ministerial meeting at 15:30 on the Thursday. Nick Holgate, RBKC Chief Executive, was not able to answer detailed questions about the situation on the ground and appeared quite defensive, trying to assure ministers that no additional help was required. In my opinion, he was not reassuring, and my sense was that others in the meeting agreed. It seemed strange to me, given the scale and complexity of the incident, that the Council were not asking for central government support. Did she, that is Catherine Richardson, relay that to you, her impression to you?
No, not directly, as I recall. She might have done. I might have seen her when she came back to the department. But I remember the conversation with Helen specifically. But I think we were all basically having conversations about the same things at this point.
Did Helen Mcnamara express to you her view that the department needed to put more pressure on RBKC to accept offers of support?
Yes.
And what did you do about that?
Well, I thought that was right. I mean, I hadn't been at the meeting myself, but I was aware of the various concerns that had been raised during the day, and we were getting increasingly worried. And at some point, I spoke to Joe Farrer that afternoon or early evening, and we agreed that she should go with the Secretary of State and Alok Sharma the following day and see what was going on.
Can we go to CLG 408227, please? Now, this is an email of the following morning, 16th of June, 2017, the Friday. And if you go to the top of the page, please, you can see there's an email on that morning at 8:23 from Helen Mcnamara to Francis Cohen within the DCLG, forwarding an email below from Catherine Richardson to Robert Mason and the ministers. It says, I mentioned to Melanie yesterday, we need to really get onto this. Actual PM is concerned, and this will run away from us if we haven't done something concrete today. Don't think politely waiting for Nick H to ask is the right tactic. We are basically being told to grip. Now, was it your approach to wait for Nicholas Holgate to ask for help, politely or otherwise?
Well, no, we'd offered help many times, and by this stage, we were getting pretty worried that they weren't responding to those offers, but actually also that the evidence was that the situation on the ground was deteriorating, or had already deteriorated quite significantly. So by this point, on Friday morning, in my mind, I was turning my thoughts to what we needed to do to intervene in the council, not necessarily in a formal sense, but how we needed to put people in alongside them to support the recovery efforts.
Now, looking at the conversation that she refers to yesterday, did Helen Mcnamara make it clear to you that there was in any way some kind of implicit criticism from the Prime Minister that waiting for Nick Holgate to ask was the wrong tactic and that you should be getting more of a grip as a department?
I didn't really take it as criticism. I mean, I think it's quite common in these situations for the centre of government to express a view quite forcibly. And I think if you're sensitive in the department, you can see that as criticism, but sometimes you're just being told something very clearly and you just have to hear it. So, they were right. We did need to change our approach as central government, and we did that morning. And as I was saying earlier, I think, and as I said in my witness statement, I think the question is what we could have done sooner. But by this stage, I don't think there was any disagreement going on amongst us that we needed to somehow to find a way to change what was going on the ground.
Right.
We didn't quite know what was going on or what needed to be changed, but Joe went there and I think immediately got onto the issues and began to come up with solutions.
Now, just sticking with the morning of the 16th of June for the moment, we've jumped ahead in the chronology and we will come back to the 15th very shortly, but just sticking with early morning on the 16th, the Friday, can we go to CLG 403272 and look at the second email on the page? And it's an email from Lorna Grattan in number 10 at 0741 on the 16th of June. Hello, I spoke to Helen Mack yesterday after the cross-government meeting. There are still concerns here about how well organised the response effort is for those in receipt of it on the ground. Would it be helpful for them to have more support from CLG, e.g. a small team of people seconded, similar to the Victim Support Unit? Could you let me know what you think? And if you go then up to the first email, in the first line on that page, you can see that Sajid Javid responds, and I should have pointed out to you that Lorna Grattan's email was to his office, and he responds to you, I'll send some email to you and Helen Mcnamara. Morning all, I just discussed briefly with Francis. I believe that MD's view, and I think MD is you,
Yes.
is that we can be more helpful in other ways. It would be able to get a couple of lines we could use to go back to number 10 this morning on what we think the best way forward is. I know there's a lot on, so sorry to add another item to the pile. Thanks. Tom, and that came from Tom Hinchcliffe, who was Sajid Javid's private secretary. Do you know what that's referring to, that conversation, or the belief that you had?
So I was of the view, and Frances Cohen was my private secretary and ran my office, and so she will have accurately understood my views. And I was of the view that sending in teams of civil servants was not what the council needed. What the council needed was, well, I didn't know what they needed at that stage, to be honest, at any level of detail, but I didn't think that sending Whitehall officials in was likely to be the solution, simply because most civil servants have absolutely no experience of emergency responses like this and could have made the situation worse rather than better. So ministers throughout these days were quite keen to send officials in, and I felt that it was quite important to push back on that. And I did think we could be helpful in other ways. I explained some of this, I think, in my second witness statement, but particularly through finance, which we did, through liaison, which we did, and in fact, that was what John Barradell asked for later on the Friday, and also through the Victim Support Unit, supporting access into central government services.
Did you, you told us about a discussion you'd had with Sajid Javid on the morning of the 15th at 9:30, but was there a later discussion you had with him during that day at which you expressed the view attributed to you here?
I don't know whether I expressed that view to Sajid Javid on the Thursday or the Friday, but I think Francis is conveying my view to Sajid's private secretary here, rather than me talking to Sajid directly. He was, at this point, must have been on his way to Kensington and Chelsea, so I don't think I saw him on the Friday morning.
Coming back then to the Thursday, the 15th of June, in the evening, it's right, I think, according to Jo Farah's statement, that she sought contact with Nicholas Holgate that afternoon or evening at about 5 p.m, yes? Are you aware of that?
She left him a message, I think, in the afternoon on the Thursday.
Indeed.
Yes.
Exactly.
She sought to contact him, yes.
She did. And I can show you the message. Let's have it up just for the sake of the evidence. CLG 403203. It's an email confirming that she had left him a message. At the top of the email, I've left a message with the CEX. He will come back if he needs to. But I've told him you are working with his team. Was this part of a strategy, perhaps, to apply a bit of pressure to Nicholas Holgate to accept your support at this point?
Well, yes, I think we were clear that we needed to apply some pressure or else it wouldn't be accepted, the offer that we were making. Yeah. And so definitely we would have been thinking at that point that we needed to be quite forceful. Yes.
Now, on the afternoon of the 15th, I think you and Jo Farah came together to discuss the council's response. We know that from the statements, but was that before or after her attempt to contact him at 5 o'clock? Do you know? Do you remember?
It was after the ministerial meeting, I think. So that would date it to later in the afternoon. And I don't know whether she contacted him after she and I had spoken or whether it was just before. I just can't remember.
Right. If we go to your statement, your first statement, please, at page 16, paragraph 51. You say there that you discussed the response with Jo Farah. Some of the officers working in the council's housing teams were well known to people in the department, and our general view at that stage was that in responding to the housing challenge, RBKC was capable and had significant expertise and experience. And did they express their views of the council's staff expertise and experience to you?
Not directly, no, but Laura Johnson in particular was known to, I believe, Fiona Darby and Lizzie Clifford, because they had both worked in local government housing, and they knew her to be an experienced housing director, and I think that was what they meant. Right. And I think, to be honest, we probably rather over-relied on that sense that this was a person who was capable, because in the end that was just one person, and I think we over-relied on that rather than on any broader sense of their capabilities or of the wider leadership of the Gold effort in Kensington and Chelsea.
Yes, thank you. And I think a decision was then made that Jo Farah should visit the council the next day with ministers to assess the situation.
Yes.
Yes. Why was it decided that Dr. Farah should be the one to attend?
Well, Helen Mcnamara had a rest day on the Friday and then worked over the weekend, and she wasn't available. But in any event, Jo was the right person, in my opinion, because she had run 2 councils and led emergency responses. So she had all the right experience to really know what was going on and know what might be needed. And
we'll come to that meeting with the Housing Minister, I think, shortly. But before we do, can we turn first to events on the morning of the 16th of June, which we've covered a little bit already. But coming back to that, CLG 408289. This is, if you look at the first email in the string, an email from Lorna Grattan to you or your office, copied to the office of, and also to the office of Sajid Javid, copied to Alistair Whitehead at number 10, at 11:06 in the morning, following a discussion between the two of you and Louise Morgan. Yes?
Yes.
Thank you very much for the useful conversation just now. To confirm for the meeting below and for the PM to confirm publicly this afternoon, we would like CLG to be able to commit to, and then there's a long list of bullet points. And I don't want to read them all out to you, but you can see them there. A date by which all residents would have been rehoused, ideally within 2 weeks. Detailed what checks are taking place on buildings. We know where all buildings with similar cladding are. Fire brigade inspections. Impose further support for RBKC in the form of additional coordination support, seconded staff, immediate review of the relevant building regulations. And then you say, you thought all this sounded doable, please let me know if any of that changes. Louise' question, grateful for a heads up before the meeting if you can on exactly what the offer will be on each. A copy of Sajid's briefing, if that is the easiest way to do it, or to do, would be fine. And then there's something about the victims of terrorism unit as well. Now, I show you that. If we go to your first statement, please, at page 17, having shown you that contemporaneous email, paragraph 56, you say, under the heading 16th of June 2017, it had become increasingly clear overnight that there were problems with the response in North Kensington. Lorna Grattan, the Prime Minister's private secretary, had emailed the Secretary of State's office at 6:30, expressing concerns about how well organised the response effort was and suggesting that more support from the department was needed. And I think we've seen that email. I spoke to Lorna to discuss the situation and agreed we would quickly provide more information to number 10 on rehousing and the support that was being provided by central government, as well as the latest on building safety checks. Now, you refer to the conversation there. First, do you remember when, even roughly during the morning, that took place?
I think it was quite early, and when I saw the various emails that you were displaying earlier, I thought it was sensible for me to just have a chat with Lorna. I knew her, and I can't remember who instigated it, but I was very glad to speak to her and just try to cut through a little bit what was going on. And I think it was probably at about 8:30. It may have been a little bit later, but of that sort of broad time.
Right. And was that, as recorded here, the full extent of your conversation, or was anything else discussed?
Well, I'm not sure I've seen Lorna's contemporaneous note recently. My apologies if I have referred to it in my statements before, but I think this is about right. I mean, clearly there's quite a lot on the building safety checks that we were discussing. You can see that from her record. I won't go on about that. I do remember the rehousing target as it became being discussed, and you can see in Lorna's email that she says there were nuances, and I think I will have said yes, there really were nuances. I think it was the first time that morning that a timescale was being suggested. The previous day it had been just about a commitment to rehouse in the local area. And so putting a timescale on it was clearly going to be more difficult, and I think I will have, well, I know I did explain some of that. And the briefing that went in from the department into the meeting later that day, the cross-ministerial meeting, didn't include a timescale. It said as early as possible or something like that. So we had a discussion about that, but it was quite clear number 10 wanted a time, and she put that in her email, which I think was important that she did, because that was what ministers wanted. What's not in my witness statement is the reference to the emergency coordinator. That part, I don't know whether there's a reference to that over the page, but that was also part of the conversation, and I recall talking to her about whether or not a team of civil servants would be useful, and explaining to her, as I was just doing now, why I thought that wasn't going to be the right answer. So her account is a bit more detailed than is in my witness statement, but it is consistent, yes. We discussed the full range of issues.
If we then go to CLG 403345, we can see in the last email on the page an email at 11:05 entitled MD Lorna Chat.
Yes.
And it says, Melanie has just spoken to Lorna and has agreed by 1 p.m. And then it goes over the page. We will provide lines for the PM on rehousing people in the local area. We will look to do this within 2 weeks. And we would need to define what we mean by permanent and local area and ensure both speed and quality, which may need to be a bit longer. Joe to work with the LA to set out what is possible. And then there are other things as well. You can see what they are. We understand, it says at the end, that the PM will chair a meeting at 1:30 and will be visiting the site today again, plus we'll be making an announcement in the early afternoon. Now, first, why was it deemed necessary for this information to be provided to the PM by 1 p.m. that day? This particular information about rehousing and within 2 weeks.
Well, clearly, ministers wanted to make a commitment about rehousing. And when I spoke to Lorna, I don't know whether she said the Prime Minister is going to chair a meeting later on. She might not have known that by then. But clearly they wanted to make an announcement. There was a very big challenge in the media about rehousing and lots of allegations that actually weren't true about people being placed in cities far away from London. But I think ministers felt they needed to get something out there quite quickly to supplement what they'd said the day before.
Right.
And so that's why the urgency. In the end, I don't know whether we provided information for the Prime Minister prior to the meeting or whether we all just went along to the meeting and discussed it then.
Did you look into how realistic it was to rehouse everyone in the local area within 2 weeks?
I didn't look into it, but I didn't think it was going to be deliverable. And when it says here in this account, we will look to do this within 2 weeks, I don't think that was us volunteering that from GCLG or me volunteering that. I think it is more, as Lorna actually says in her account of the discussion, that the ministers wanted to do it in 2 weeks, and she understood that there were nuances, and I will have explained those.
But one of the nuances being it wasn't possible.
It just wasn't going to be possible. I mean, to be fair, I don't think we knew quite how impossible it would be, because I don't think we had the experience of quite how difficult it is to take bereaved and traumatised families through the decision-making and that they need to make when they're thinking about longer-term housing options. And I don't think my ministers had that in their minds that morning, really.
Now, moving forward into the morning, CLG 3030638, we've already referred to the visit by Joe Farrer that day. And here is an email at 10:30. Oh, no, I'm sorry, a text, actually, at 10:30. Great. No, hold on. The timing's not quite right with this, but this I think is 13:21 actually, and it says, personally, great. We'll report back. Personally worried that council are out of their depth. Have said we will give some housing officers. We'll also sort out comms. I think it should be comms support with the LGA. And then I think your response, feel free to make big judgment call if we need to make massive Whitehall offer or demand LGA one. Part of what we need to do is keep leaping ahead of the immediate situation. What did you mean there by a massive Whitehall offer?
I think by the way that this exchange was earlier in the morning because, as I think you're hinting, by 13:21, John Browdell was already in place and the meeting was about to start in the Cobra meeting rooms. I didn't precisely know. I was leaving it to Jo's judgment, and I trusted her judgment. But the sort of things I was thinking about were previous situations I've been involved in when a significant injection of local government expertise had been provided to councils that were failing or were struggling to deliver core parts of their duties. And obviously sometimes that had been done through interventions and formal interventions in commissioners, but sometimes it had been done through voluntary panels or task forces. And those things had been organised and orchestrated by the Local Government Association. So I just wanted Jo to feel free to offer whatever she thought was needed.
And I think you then spoke to her and agreed it would be beneficial for John Browdell, who was already on site, to take over as Gold Command.
Yes.
Yes. And do you know what else was discussed in that call? Do you remember?
No, I'm sure Jo will have told me about how worried she was. I doubt we spoke for very long because there's a lot going on. But she will have. I think she was the person who told me that John Browdell had been mobilised in.
Right. Now, if we go to CLG 408313, and let me show you page 1 at the start to show that you're at the top of this email chain. It comes through to you. You see that? Or at least your office.
My office, yes.
Yes. Now, if we go then to the bottom of page 2, the start of the email I want to show you is at 0:25, so after midnight on the 16th of June, and it's from Charlie Parker at Westminster to a number of others. So it filters its way through to you the next morning. But if you go to the final paragraph on page 3, let's look at that together. He says that I've offered NH, that's Nicholas Holgate, total WCC support. However, I don't believe he quite understands the magnitude of the problem and the implications of a government-led inquiry. I will be offering him a lot of personal support and will see him tomorrow. However, I fear a lot of turmoil, uncertainty as to his and leading members' future may be on the horizon. This will be exacerbated by the constant updating of fatality numbers. Now, when you got that email, you could see, is this right, that at least the Chief Executive of Westminster Council thought that the Chief Executive of RBKC did not understand the magnitude of the problem, yes?
Yes.
What was your reaction to learning of that in the email when you saw it the next day?
By the time I saw this email, I think John Barrowdale was already in his new role, or at least it had been agreed that he would be in the new role. And I remember thinking that we were in exactly the same place as Charlie Parker had been. And I remember thinking, I wish he'd sent that email to me as well last night. That might have been helpful.
Right, I see. And was this before, when you saw this, it's 11:47, was this before or after Joe Farrer had a conversation with Nicholas Holgate about him stepping back?
I'm not quite sure, but I am pretty confident that I did not see this email, and neither did Joe, until after she had spoken to John Barrowdale. I don't think this email influenced the decision-making. I think it corroborated the decision that we'd made, or that Joe had agreed with John and John O'Brien, rather than actually being part of what made them decide it.
So did it corroborate the concerns that had been raised with you by
Yes.
Joe Farrer from her visit?
Yes, and also what we knew from Thursday about how we were finding the council to deal with.
Then let's go to CLG 403399. This takes us into the mid-afternoon of that day. Email from Robert Mason of Red to you and Sajid Javid. Well, Sajid Javid copied to you and to the office of Joe Farrer. So this comes up to you at 14:47, as you can see. And what is important about this is the email below it, which is in the string. It starts at the bottom of your screen, but if we can scroll up, please, we can see the head of it. It comes from Philip James, who's the resilience advisor in Red. He says, Catherine, Rob, ahead of the SCG, I spoke to the Police Gold Commander, Neil Jerome. In a confidential conversation, he raised his concern regarding RBKC local authority. The main points he made are, first bullet, the LA are way out of their depth. Second, Nick Holgate did not come across well yesterday at the cross-government ministerial meeting. There is a lot of anger from the residents directed towards the LA. He said it is not acceptable that people have now spent 2 nights in a rest centre. Police are happy for there to be a meeting with the residents, which includes all of the appropriate key agencies from the multi-agency SCG to talk to residents and address some of their concerns where possible. LA are not keen on this idea. And it goes on a little bit further. Now, do you remember, did you do anything on receipt of that email at 14:47?
At that time, I was in the ministerial meeting, so I can't say exactly when I saw this email, but it's very consistent with everything that was being discussed by that point. So all of those issues we were well aware of, and indeed quite worried about.
Right.
But by that point, John Barrowdale had taken over.
Yeah, I see. Now, then moving further into the day on the 16th, Friday, CAB 405727. Email from Lorna Grattan, 1937, to you and Louise Morgan. Further support to RBKC. Louise, Melanie, as you know, the PM met local residents from Grenfell this afternoon and left with the overwhelming message that the council don't have a grip. I know you know this, and that's why you've set up Gold Command, but in particular, she's keen we make a further offer to RBKC / Gold Command of the kind that they find very hard to refuse. In particular, pull together what additional resource you quickly put into the council and have it ready to go, make contact with Gold Command in order to go round K&C, and identify where we could immediately and helpfully place people. I understand you're kindly putting together a short email for us on what CLG will be offering so we can put it in front of the PM. Now, I don't know whether there's a response to that email that you sent to Lorna Grattan. Can you help?
No, I'm afraid I don't recall. I mean, at about the same time, I emailed into Mark Sedwill giving my assessment of where things were following the meeting. But I don't recall that, and it looks as though it came directly into my own personal email box, so I will have seen it. I didn't leave the office until quite late that night. I just don't remember if I responded.
I mean, did you know what was involved in making a Corleone-esque offer of this nature?
Well, look, from this point on, once John Barradell had been put in place, as I said in my email to Mark Sedwell later that afternoon, which we may come on to, although the underlying problems clearly weren't solved, I felt that finally we had leadership in place that had identified the right issues. He was drawing people around him to be able to get things done with the right expertise, and there was just a sense of palpable grip and determination. Now, I think it took Gold Command several days to recover the problems created by those early days and the mistakes. But my view from this point on was that we had to put what effort we had in central government into supporting Gold Command. So what I read this email as saying now is that ministers were still quite uncomfortable and wanted us to do more directly from central government. But there was another meeting the following morning, which I believe the Prime Minister chaired. And so I think that was another conversation where we went around the same questions of should we do more, but ultimately concluded we should support Gold Command. Right. But we did also, we'd already agreed by this evening actually to put together the victims unit.
Well, yes, and we may touch on that shortly, but let me just show you an email sent a little bit later the same evening, CLG 405219. At 1954, on the 16th of June, Alistair Whitehead, second email down, to Peter Hill at number 10 and others. And it looks as if this is an internal number 10 communication. Oh, the Prime Minister called the leader of Kensington and Chelsea Council this evening here with a readout. And there are 6 bullet points. PM reported that from her visit, the overwhelming message from those affected was that there had been no communication from the council, and people didn't feel the council was coordinating things properly. Leader reported there had been a big response from the voluntary sector, and the council officers were engaged. But there had been some confusion, and the council is not held in the highest regard. PM emphasised the issues that had been raised with her, and that the financial aid must get through. DCLG will be in contact with RBKC to ensure that proper processes are in place. And then it continues, leader committed to having all people rendered homeless in housing by the end of the day, but noted a few times the difficulty of getting permanent rehousing in KNC. The PM said it was important to have the numbers involved so we can monitor progress on the commitment and to be sure of where all the people are. Leader said that RBKC needed help to free up housing. The PM said that DCLG will be able to help identify housing in other boroughs. PM sought an assurance that someone from the council will be in touch this evening with every one of the support centres. The leader agreed this. Now, that's a that's a readout from a discussion they had. Were you aware of the detail of that discussion or the particulars of this email on that evening?
I don't think so, no.
And you say in your first witness statement to paragraph 10, there's no need to go to it, that one of the DCLG's long-standing functions is to provide what you call a link between central government and local responders when it comes to responding to emergencies. Do you know why it took the Prime Minister personally visiting the scene for those issues to be fully aired and then action taken?
Well, I think all these issues were already on the table. You know, we'd had a meeting earlier that day, chaired by the Prime Minister, with John Barradell and Nicholas Holgate on the line, and many of these issues had been discussed, including the need to sort out housing. And I think when the Prime Minister says that DCLG, for example, I'm talking about the penultimate bullet, will be able to help identify housing in other boroughs, that wasn't new. I mean, she was saying what we'd already discussed and aired in ministerial meetings, not just on Friday, but I think in previous days. The permanent rehousing work had started some days before. So I think the issues around financial aid getting through, I don't know whether that was discussed on the Friday afternoon. That may have been a new issue that emerged in the evening. But I see this as a continuation of a conversation. And I'm not surprised that every time anyone visited, there was a slightly new issue that needed to be sent back. But the point was that it should be sent back. And I presume that at some level, Number 10 did communicate some of this back into DCLG. I don't know, but I assume they did. I would have expected them to have done.
I mean, my question really is there anything in this email, this conversation, which this email reflects, which hadn't been discussed and brought to light in the earlier meeting that day at 13:30?
I don't think so, no.
Right.
Except possibly the financial aid issue being very difficult operationally. That may have come through slightly later.
I follow. Now let's go to CAB 30120015. This takes us a little bit earlier in the afternoon. This is an email on the Friday afternoon from Mark Sedwill to Catherine Hammond. Catherine, well done with today's meeting, and I think that's the 13:30 meeting, which we're going to come to perhaps backwards, but never mind. It was clear that K&C are completely out of their depth, so we should probably have prompted a DCLG intervention earlier. But all that can come out via lessons learned, IDC, in due course. Shall I follow up with Melanie on London/HMG support for K&C, or do you think all of that is in hand? First, do you agree with Mark Sedwill's assessment that we, as in central government, or the CCS, should probably have prompted a DCLG intervention earlier?
I think, as I was saying to you this morning, that Joe and I should have thought on Wednesday and Thursday about whether or not London Resilience was being mobilised in support of the council, and that would have been the right intervention, and indeed turned out to be the right intervention, although it was a bigger one than usual. And so, yes, I think central government collectively should have thought about that more on Wednesday and Thursday. I've always believed, and still do believe, that it's about the London Gold support being provided earlier rather than a team of civil servants going on the ground to somehow take over or support.
Was it your view, though, that the incident should also perhaps have prompted an earlier intervention or coordination by the Cabinet Office, the CCS?
Well, I would have hoped that we would have got there before them, but there were two meetings on Wednesday and Thursday when certainly it's true that there was no challenge from the centre that we should be intervening. And in fact, almost no mention, including in this email, about the importance of the London Gold arrangements and the London Resilience arrangements. And this is where I think the Cabinet Office perhaps, you know, and everybody at the centre was thinking in terms of what central government should do rather than about activating the existing resilience arrangement adequately for the task in hand. So I think they were slightly on the wrong place on some of this. I also think that the fact that there was nobody there from the local area apart from the Mayor's office at the Wednesday meeting didn't help, because one of the big factors that alerted us to the problems on Thursday was just the way that Nick Holgate wasn't able to handle the questions he was asked. And he wasn't there on Wednesday, and I know that was an administrative oversight, I believe, but it just seems quite odd to me that nobody was there and somehow nobody scrabbled about when they realised that in the meeting and went and found somebody. So again, that was a gap in the intelligence that was brought to bear in the CCS meetings.
Now, last thing on this, he asks, shall I follow up with Melanie on London HMG support for K&C? Did he? Did Mark Sedwill?
No, I don't think so.
Right. Now, we know that the meeting took place, the the task force meeting took place at 13:30 on the 16th of June, chaired by the Prime Minister, and we've covered that and the documents with other witnesses. You attended that meeting, didn't you, with Alok Sharma and others?
On Friday.
On Friday?
Yes, I did.
You did.
I'm not recorded as having attended in the minutes, but I was there.
Yes. Yes, according to your statement, paragraph 65, I think. But also John Barradell was there, wasn't he?
He was on the phone.
He was on the... Yes, he dialed in.
Yeah.
Do you remember, did John Barradell say anything at the meeting?
Yes, he said a lot.
Did he articulate any difficulties that he had encountered?
I think you'd have to go back to the minutes, but what I recall is that he gave a sense of the challenge he thought he was facing, the things that needed to be done. I had spoken to him before the meeting. I'd never met him before, but we spoke briefly before the meeting, and he had told me to expect that it might be a bit odd because as to who would speak compared to him or Nicholas Holgate, but in the end he took over pretty much, and I don't think Nicholas Holgate really said very much at all, is my recollection.
And was it your clear understanding at the time that John Barradell had taken over
Yes.
as opposed to standing alongside supporting Nicholas Holgate.
Yes.
And did you have any understanding of what the basis for that takeover was?
No, not at a level of detail, but I understood that he was now the gold commander for the recovery effort, was I think what it was called. They were the recovery task force, but we were clearly in response mode as well at that point.
Now, having got to the end of the 16th of June 2017 and discussed your concerns, am I right in thinking that it was clear to you at the end of that day that the situation in RBKC was still very challenging, notwithstanding that John Barradell had been in charge since earlier that day?
Yes, it was still very challenging.
And can we enumerate those challenges in particular, including protests, challenges faced by some of the families, the situation at the rest centres, reports of unrest, chaos on the streets?
Yes.
Were you aware that John Barradell had had a call with the Secretary of State that evening at about 7 p.m?
Yes.
You were?
I think I probably suggested it.
And were you on that call?
No.
No. Were you aware that John Barradell had told the Secretary of State that he had made significant progress such that he, Secretary of State, could be assured that the situation was coming under proper control?
I can't recall exactly how I became aware of what they discussed, but that sounds perfectly plausible to me that would have been what he said.
Now, let's then move into the evening of the 16th. CLG 1009767. Um, 9767. CLG 1009767. Yes, there it is. Thank you. Now, what we see here, a second email down, is an email from you to Mark Sedwill, 2026. And if you look at the third line down, you say, as I said in the margins of Cobra, John Barradell took over at lunchtime as Gold Command for the whole recovery, and he has just rung me with an update. He has clearly made very significant progress this afternoon, and I think we can now be assured that the situation is coming under proper control. The key points, and then you set them all out. Can I just ask you whether it was your impression that he'd made significant progress, or something that he told you?
Well, it was mainly what he'd told me. I hadn't been there myself on the ground, but I had heard him describing what he was doing in the meeting earlier on, and I had no reason to doubt that the things he was telling me were true. I was particularly assured by the way that he was bringing in leadership around him, and that we had, at that point, 3 serving chief executives. I think by the end of the weekend it was another 2.
Yeah.
And it was really his overall understanding of what needed to be done that I found persuasive. I knew it was going to take a long time to get those things done.
Now, we've seen the bullet points with others in their evidence, particularly Catherine Hammond. I don't need to reread them to you, particularly since they're your own record. But can we take it that that is an accurate record of the gist of the points in the call?
Yes, I stand by this record completely. This is what John said, but it's also how I expressed it to Mark Sedwill was what I believed to be true at the time.
Indeed. Now then you go on to say, after the list of bullet points, on KNC itself, John is clear that they are in a bad way. At official level, the gold structure manages this risk for the time being. It has basically taken over. At political level, other London councils are coming in with support. After the immediate crisis is over, we will clearly need to consider a long-term solution. Now, what did you mean by at political level, or what did you think he meant by at political level? Other councils are coming in with support.
I don't particularly remember the political element of this at the time, but what I think I must have been referring to is that other councillors, i.e. elected politicians, so at a political level, were coming in to support the elected leadership of the council as well. I can't quite remember with this distance what that support was, because I was mainly concerned with the official arrangements, but I think there must have been something going on to support Nick Paget-Brown, and that must have been what I was referring to, is my best guess.
Now, the statement, KNC itself, John is clear that they are in a bad way. What did you understand him? Well, sorry, let me rephrase the question. Was that your impression of what he was telling you, or did he say to you, they are in a bad way?
I can't remember exactly what the language was that he used, but I could easily have used that language myself. So I think he was probably telling me that Nicholas Holgate and his team were really struggling, hadn't had any sleep, hadn't had any rest, must have been feeling terrible that their jobs had been taken over and that essentially they had failed to manage the immediate response. So I could easily have used that language myself, and it may be my interpretation of what he said, but we were in the same place when we had that conversation.
Now, you go on in the next paragraph to say, we have embedded Red Response and Housing Liaison into the local effort this afternoon, as well as helping on the ground. This will also ensure we start to get the information we need on rehousing, etc. Is that right?
Yes.
You've done that?
Yes, we had.
So is it right that by the time you sent that email to Mark Sedwill, you were of the view that the response had significantly improved?
Well, I was aware that the leadership and the capabilities had significantly improved.
Now, we have... I'm
yeah.
sorry.
But I wasn't, I think, really passing any judgment on the situation on the ground.
I see. So your impression was that things had been done by John immediately, but the results had not yet started to filter through.
Yes, I don't think I was saying they hadn't filtered through yet, but I wasn't assuming they had. And I don't think there's anything in there in my email that says that it was, significantly improved for the survivors and those who had lost loved ones or those affected by the fire. But I was clear that their leadership and capability was significantly better than it had been in the morning.
Now, this email goes to Mark Sedwill at 2026. If we go to CAB 404653, we can see that he responds the same evening at 2227, or at least he comes to you at that time. It is a response. And he asks, Jeremy Hayward asks, what is the actual position on the displaced tenants? Are they all being housed locally in hotels? I assume none are literally having to sleep on the streets, ? And you respond 3 minutes later at 22:30 that evening. None on the streets, all in hotels or in some cases still in rest centre if that's their preference. They are tricky families to rehouse, especially in these terrible circumstances, but it's happening. This will be a key set of stats being reported into COBRA regularly. Alloc is all over this, and the tower block checks. Now, my question is, where did you get the information to answer Jeremy Hayward's question that none were on the streets, all were in hotels, or in some cases still in the rest centre?
I must have known that was the case, particularly given that I responded so quickly, or at least I must have been told that was the case. He was saying, are they literally having to sleep on the streets? Which implies a level of being forced to sleep on the streets because there was no alternative. And I replied, well, no, they have hotels, or in some cases they're in the rest centres. And I think by this hour I had already spoken to the Secretary of State about the family he was particularly concerned about, for whom efforts had been made during that day to find a solution, but they just hadn't worked, and that family had decided to stay in the rest centre. So I knew there were still some people in the rest centre.
Right. CLG 409897, please, page 2. There's an email from Sally Randall, second email down there, to Ellen Reach, copy to Fiona Darby, Lizzie Clifford and Rory McBride, rough sleeping. Ellen, I passed on your feedback that the outreach teams had found no Grenfell victims sleeping rough. However, SOS said that Eleanor Kelly had reported that there were Grenfell victims sleeping in cars and parks, and asked us if we could reconcile the two bits of information. It's not super urgent. I don't need an answer today. Now, the date of that email is the 22nd of June 2017. So that would be the Thursday. week after the fire. But is it the case that, in fact, even by then, there had been, or by then, there were findings that some Grenfell victims had been sleeping in cars and parks?
I don't know. I've not seen these emails before, so I wasn't aware of this.
No. And if we go then to CLG 408779, please. If we go, please, to page 2, at the bottom of the page, first, to establish the date. This is now the Saturday, 17th of June, 2017, at 11:47, from Mark Sedwill to you, copied to people at the Cabinet Office, including Catherine Hammond. Hi, Melanie. Over the page, please, page 3. Hi, Melanie. Thanks. I was on the phone at today's Cobra. A few points struck me. And then halfway down the email, John B's sense of grip was palpable, so I hope the situation on the ground will now gain and demonstrate some momentum. But do we need a gold for Whitehall on all the wider issues, or maybe a gold plus gold minister, e.g. Joe Farrer, plus Greg Hands? They would have to drop everything else. I fear this will become our New Orleans otherwise. Mark. First, what did you understand Mark Sedwill's reference to New Orleans to mean here?
To be honest, I didn't really know. He and I discussed this the following day, but I was guessing, a humanitarian crisis on a very large scale.
Did you consider the suggestion that there be a gold for Whitehall or a gold plus gold minister?
Yes, we discussed it at some length on Sunday morning, and it was a very constructive conversation, actually, and Mark and I were trying to work through what the various different elements of the work were. He knew I only had 3 Directors General to lead on this. I had already agreed with Jeremy Hayward that I would have a 4th to lead on building safety. I spent much of Sunday trying to find that person, talking to different people. But we were trying to work out what Helen's role could be, what Joe's role could be, what my role could be. And the outcome of our conversation is summarised in my email to him, which maps what we had discussed. And in the end, he agreed with me that my ministers, Sajid, Javid and Alok Sharma, should remain the overall lead, but also that Nick Hurd should play the role of specific support for the community, which he did for a very long time. So we sort of agreed it then. This was really, I think, the moment where we were thinking about the recovery phase.
Yes.
And this was probably the turning point when we shifted a bit more into that mode and thought about the structures and accountabilities that were going to be needed.
Let's then turn into the 17th of June a bit more closely, the Saturday. I think you recall there was a Grenfell Recovery Task Force meeting at 11 o'clock that morning.
Yes. Yes.
And you attended that with Alok Sharma and Catherine Richardson, I think.
Yes, and the Secretary of State.
And the Secretary of State, indeed. How would you describe the mood of that meeting?
It was very sober. All those meetings were very sober because of the nature of the events, but it was constructive. I thought it was a good meeting.
And I think it's right, isn't it, and summarising your statement at paragraph 78, there were a number of key actions identified for your department, including more visible presence at Grenfell to facilitate access to support services. Yes?
Yes.
Providing additional financial help for the victims.
Yes.
Yes. And monitoring progress on what I think had by then become the 3-week announced target for rehousing.
Yes.
Yes, and then after that meeting, you went, is this right, to Portland House with the Secretary of State?
Yes, I did.
Yes. Why did you do that?
Well, at this point, I hadn't actually been to the local area, and I thought it was quite important that I get an understanding of what was going on, but we weren't able to do that because of the public order issues. We went instead to the Gold Command headquarters at Portland House, and actually later that day, we were asked by John Baradell that there be no further Whitehall visits, and so we respected that.
Right. Now, I think when you got there, you saw several London chief executives working full-time in Gold Command. Is that right?
Yes, well, they'd just arrived, I think, but they were, I think, to be deployed full-time, at least for a few weeks.
Right. And I think they included, is this right, Eleanor Kelly from Southwark?
Carolyn Downs and Paul Nazarek as well, I remember.
And did you gain the impression that they were well enough resourced?
They were starting, and certainly when I saw those individuals, I was very impressed. These were some of the really heavyweight London chief executives.
Now, if we go to your first statement, you say at paragraph 80 on page 26, of this meeting, that in the second half of the paragraph, you say, I asked John what more we could do to help. He said there was a significant obstacle in that housing was not fully under the Gold Command structure, and this was needed to manage the relief effort fully. He asked me to persuade Nicholas Holgate to pass the responsibility for rehousing from RBKC to Gold Command. I had a long conversation with Nicholas. He agreed to my request, and John later told me the transfer of responsibilities had taken place. Now, why had the element of the response, or perhaps recovery, relating to housing remained with Nicholas Holgate and not brought under the Gold arrangements?
Well, on the Friday evening, I thought it had moved across. That was in my email to Mark Sedwell, that
Yes.
it had moved across. And so I was a bit surprised to hear that this was still a sticking point on the Saturday. My understanding is that in the end, these were very unusual arrangements for John effectively to take over in the role of chief executive of the council in his Gold role. And it was one that was done by mutual agreement with Nicholas Holgate. And I assume that Nicholas Holgate hadn't wanted to move the housing work across. And that was the impression I got from John on Saturday.
So, to be clear, your impression from John Barradell was that Nicholas Holgate had been reluctant to surrender control of the housing or rehousing effort.
Yes.
And did he give you a sense of why? Why Nicholas Holgate was so reluctant?
No, not really. All I remember is that without them having that responsibility, they really weren't effectively able to communicate with the residents or do most of the things that were needed for the recovery.
Did John Barradell ask for any further help from the department?
Yes, he asked me to go and persuade Nicholas to move the housing element across to Gold, and that's what I did.
And other than that?
No, I mean, he'd already asked for liaison, which was provided by Jill McManus. He asked for a few things over that weekend. I can't remember exactly when, but this is the one I remember from Saturday afternoon.
And I think there was also communications assistance with Simon Wren moving from the Home Office to the DCLG to help the new or to act as the new Director of Communications. Is that?
Yes, that was a decision that I made and was seeking support on. It wasn't anything to do with the Gold Command, so
No.
That was entirely a government decision. We did place Farouk Mullah with Gold as a communications specialist. I think that had happened by Saturday morning, though. And that was probably agreed the day before.
And was that organised by DCLG or by the Home Office or just...
By DCLG. Farouk was one of our staff.
And did that resolve the concerns that you'd had reported to you in the early hours of the 16th of June, which we've seen, which was that the department wasn't completely on top of the communications?
Yes, I mean the communications from the department's perspective. So now we've come back to 2 Marsham Street, away from Portland House. I think the conversation, the concern I had on Thursday afternoon and Friday was that, as I explained in my witness statements, we had a very small communications team. It had been quite significantly cut, and our deputy director was also very new, and this was an absolutely massive national media story. And I needed somebody with the expertise to be able to answer calls from the Daily Mail and all the broadcasters and so on. And that was what I asked Alex Aiken for help in securing, and Simon Wren came across on Saturday morning to help. And yes, it did resolve things because he was just able to manage that kind of media story and also to liaise very effectively with Number 10 and other government departments, which was important.
Now, continuing on the theme of resources, I think you spoke to the Cabinet Office a number of times to secure additional people with experience of managing and coordinating internal departmental responses to a crisis.
Yes.
Why did you make those requests?
Because we didn't really have the expertise. I mean, overall, there was definitely an issue with numbers in the department. We were about 50% of the size that we'd been in 2010 at this point in 2017. But the problem that worried me most was that we had a few gaps in capability. And one of them was, as I was describing this morning, was just the ability to actually set up and run a response cell inside the department to coordinate all the work that we were doing in the crisis. And that needed to sit alongside Red in the role that they had in feeding the CCS machinery and liaising directly with the local area. So we had a go at setting that up on Friday, but it was a bit too like what Red do, so it was a bit too much just about information flows. I think there's an email from Rob Mason where he describes being very pleased that we called on their expertise, and we were calling on their expertise, but it wasn't quite enough because it wasn't really about decision making. And so I was desperately keen to get somebody from CCS to help us with that. And eventually Ian Whitehouse came across and did that for us. But it wasn't until the following week, and it was a bit late, to be honest.
Yes. Just picking this up at CLG 1000957, page 2. This is part of an email which starts on page 1. Just to pick up the timing of this email, please, and who it was from. It's from you to Jeremy Hayward. Yes?
Yes.
And at the very top of the chain, it filters its way. Well, there's a response, I think, to you from Sue Gray. Thank you so much. As you know, Jeremy doesn't have a clue what I get up to, so really appreciate you sending this email. Did you have a good discussion with Sue Gray before you sent this email?
The conversation with Sue Gray will have been about the public inquiry, because that's what she was doing through these days.
Right.
I don't recall when I spoke to her, but we will have spoken frequently, I think.
Right. Now, the email itself says, Jeremy, just to let you know the main things we've done today, and then if we go, please, to page 2. You say in the last paragraph under finally, it's not really the last paragraph, but it's the last big one, you should know that we are doing a lot to talk to and comfort DCLG staff involved in this policy area and in the regulators, some of whom are very upset. We also have at least one member of staff, a new apprentice with a close friend in hospital, and the father missing. Our part of the 2MS building will be surrounded by a protest tomorrow evening, so we're going to be advising our staff to go home at 5 p.m. As I said to you on the phone last night, at some point we may need to reflect on the impact of cuts to the civil service. DCLG will be less than 50% of its 2010 size by 2020 on some of our deep expert policy functions. The expertise is still there, and it's excellent, but it is sparse and overloaded. Now, I put that to you. Was there a wider problem here regarding resourcing at DCLG and Red, or perhaps all Red, which was manifesting itself in the response at government level by this point?
I don't think it was manifesting itself at government level, no. I think we I'm very proud of what we did in these days. It was immensely challenging, and it wasn't perfect, and we didn't get everything right, but given the completely unprecedented nature of what we were dealing with, we achieved an enormous amount, but there's no question that we were doing it on very sparse resources, and in some cases the capability just wasn't there in the way that I was just describing for the coordination, and in some cases, as on the communications, there just wasn't enough of it, and it wasn't senior enough. It was harder because we didn't have very many people. But morale was strong, and people were extremely collaborative, and they worked, very effectively. And I think that spoke to a very positive culture in the department, actually. But the resourcing questions were, very difficult to manage through this period. And I had a lot of support from my fellow permanent secretaries, but I had to spend quite a lot of my time getting it and asking for it. It was quite a lot of what I did in these early days.
Now, moving into the 18th of June, I think we just can continue that theme. I think on that day, the Sunday, there was, of course, we know, the further task force meeting. But is it right that you made some decisions allocating responsibilities, among those of which was to decide that Helen Mcnamara and you would continue to lead the overall coordination?
Yes.
And that Joe Farrow would play a significant role in supporting Gold Command?
Yes.
And lead on possible intervention in RBKC, I think. Now, on that day also, which is 18th June Sunday, but is it right, John Barradell appointed Paul Najazarek? Is that how you pronounce it?
I'm not quite sure, but that's pretty close.
To coordinate the humanitarian assistance under Gold Command, I think. Yes?
Yes.
Yes. And Eleanor Kelly to lead on engagement with the community.
Yes.
Yes. And was that your idea, or was that something that came from John Barradell?
It came from John Barradell.
Okay. And he knew Eleanor Kelly from Southwark?
Yes, I think she was there on Saturday, but she was appointed to that role on the Sunday.
Did things improve as a result of those decisions you made?
I didn't make the decisions in Gold Command, or are you referring to the decisions I made in the department?
In the department.
Yes, I think it clarified things as we went into the following week. And it was quite important for me to be clear with the whole department who was doing what as well. So I sent a wider email explaining some of that. But it did make a difference.
Now, I think the central government didn't provide further communication support at that time. Why is that?
Well, I think on Saturday and Sunday, there was quite a lot of concern in central government that there needed to be a stronger face of the response in Kensington and Chelsea, that the council weren't providing that. And I recall that John Barradell himself was very reluctant to be that personal face. I think he wanted to be the person who was orchestrating behind the scenes. And that's why he appointed Eleanor to be that person. That's my recollection. I think that was a good decision, actually. And so we were teetering on maybe finding somebody who could go and represent the victims and be their advocate on the ground. But in the end, when Eleanor was appointed, I think there was a sense that certainly the recovery was being properly represented on the ground. Ministers did, though, still go themselves a lot to the area to speak to people and to speak to families. They themselves were also quite present in those following days.
Now, I want to turn next briefly to the TMO. You've been asked about RBKC and the Pan-London arrangements, but looking at the TMO, do you remember that on the 20th of June, which was the Tuesday after the fire, John Barradell raised with you concerns about the TMO?
Yes, I recall that they were raised on the Monday, actually.
On the Monday. And do you remember that the concerns included problems with heating and hot water in the finger blocks, the walkways and other buildings around Grenfell Tower? And problems with leadership as well.
Yes.
Remember that? Can we go to CLG 405813 and look at the second email down on that page, please? 20th of June at 19:10 from Camilla Sheldon to a cast of recipients, including you and Helen Mcnamara. A quick readout from Cobra. Main actions for us in bold. Melanie, Gillian, please shout if I've missed anything. And then if you look at the second main heading down, the Met Police, and then there's a third main heading, support for those affected, Gold Command. Number 7 says, TMO is not reliable. Issues around hot water in particular. And then in bold, which is for you, solution is to get the right people in place. DCLG will provide update on next steps at PM Cobra Kerry.
Yes.
Now, Kerry, I think, is a reference to
Kerry McHale.
Kerry McHale, not David Kerry, just to be clear.
That's correct.
The reference to TMO is not reliable. What did you understand that was a reference to?
So my understanding is that the leadership of the TMO just wasn't working and somehow wasn't managing to communicate with residents. It wasn't present on the ground, and that underlying that problem was the fact that they still reported into the council and reported therefore in through Nicholas Holgate, and that this was becoming a real blockage on Monday because we had teams of people that we thought via the Homes and Community Properties Agency and the housing regulator that we could send in to support, but from other areas, but that offer wasn't going to be received until the leadership changed. So I recall John Barradell, I think, ringing me up about this. He said, this needs resolving, you have to resolve it, this is about the council not being prepared to take the steps they need to take. He was quite forthright. And in parallel, I think, discussions were going on about Nicholas Holgate's position. And so in the end, what happened was that the leader asked Nicholas Holgate to resign, and he stepped aside from his role, and Barry Quirk, who came and took over, acted on the TMO issues as some of the first steps he took on the Wednesday when he arrived. I think it took a while for him properly to resolve them because he wasn't fully in the role until a couple of weeks later. But these issues all were being worked on together, and they were quite sensitive, and that's why this particular reference in this email, there was quite a lot more going on behind the scenes.
Yeah. And was consideration given within the department to taking over the TMO in the same way that John Barradell had taken over RBKC?
I don't think we would ever have taken it over from the department, but we were certainly giving consideration as to how we could orchestrate a change of leadership in the TMO, which we understood to be quite a problem at that point. But more generally, we were thinking about the council and about whether or not a formal intervention was necessary, whether that could be done in time, whether it was appropriate. Joe and I had a lot of conversations about that over the weekend. I was more in the camp of surely we're going to have to intervene, and Joe was, I think, quite rightly saying, well, no, actually, the Gold Command is dealing with the immediate problem. And in the end, I don't think we did need to intervene. I think Joe was right. We did put in the task force a bit later down the line.
Mr. Chairman, can I just finish this topic off?
Yes,
a short document.
That's right, yes.
CLG 403544. This is an email string of the 19th of June, so the Monday. It is from Alex Powell at DCLG to a number of people within the department, copy to you and to the Office of the Secretary of State. And Helen Mcnamara. Kerry, thanks for the quick chat just now. As agreed, it feels right your note focuses on the KCTMO and the powers of the regulator, rather than expanding the note to include our best value powers to inspect and the wider approach to K&C, let me know. And below that, as we see it comes to you, below that is an email from at the foot of the screen. You go down to the bottom of the page, page 1, from Kerry McHale, the same day, 19th of June at 1640. Alec Taylor can hold the ring on this advice. He's already looked at the social housing regulator's powers relating to LAs. Given the timing on this will be really high-level options we'll be able to discuss, able to explore further. And what this is really about emerges on page 2, the second paragraph, or on the first main paragraph. At today's SOS meeting, Sally picked up an action to explore options for taking over the management of the Kensington and Chelsea Tenant Management Organisation. And then the rest of it is about advice and creative options, things like that. Did you get to the bottom of whether it was actually possible to take over the TMO, or take over management of the TMO, so far at least as this crisis was concerned?
I'm not sure whether we got to the bottom of that. My understanding is that the powers of the regulator are quite limited now. They were changed some years before Grenfell, so that it's now very hard for the regulator to act in anticipation of a problem rather than once it's already happened. So I think there were issues with the threshold that wouldn't have been reached or would have been difficult to prove. And so in the end, as Lisanne's email, which I think is entirely correct, says, the big difficulty was that the council would normally intervene and they were under a lot of pressure. So solving that problem was in the end the right answer, which is what happened on the Tuesday. And the council took that decision themselves, but it was what was needed to unlock the particular issue with the TMO.
Right. And did anybody in the department, did you, make any steps to speak to the TMO? Robert Black, the chief executive, or...
I didn't, but I don't know whether others did.
Right. Mr. Chairman, is that a convenient...
Well, I'd just like your help on this. What exactly was it that the TMO should have been doing that it wasn't doing?
Well, my understanding from my conversations with John Barradell was that people had left the finger blocks, but they were beginning to return. And so that was revealing a problem that they weren't fit to be habited. Part of that was because the boiler was underneath the tower itself, I think, but part of it was that they'd been damaged, and so there were other issues, and there was just no sense that the TMO was present on the ground or actually gripping those issues. Now, that was the impression that I was getting from John Bardell. It was also coming in through multiple other sources by this point, but it was really a leadership vacuum.
I asked the question because we know, as you say, that the boilers weren't working because they were in the basement of the tower. We know that the gas for the whole area had been cut off. So I think the walkways didn't have gas or hot water. But that's not a problem that you can simply solve overnight, is it?
No, but
So
I guess
what is it the TMO were failing to do?
there was, as I understand it, and I'm recalling this now after 5 years, as I understand it, there just wasn't any leadership from the TMO as perceived by those who would have expected them to be on the end of the phone, coming forward with a plan, knowing where their tenants were, communicating with those tenants and explaining what the situation was. And as a result, people just didn't know what was going on, and it was leading to quite a lot of concern and complaint, and a lot of distress, I'm sure, as well.
Yeah.
And what was the source of your information about those matters?
It was John Bardell, but was part of it. He rang me to, ask us to do something about it. But it wasn't just John Bardell. We were picking this up. I can't remember exactly where from. It may have been coming in through red channels, but there was definitely an issue about people from those blocks feeling let down, and becoming quite vocal about that, and clearly not feeling that they were being communicated with adequately.
And did John Bardell give you any indication whether he'd spoken to Robert Black or anyone else at the TMO?
I don't recall whether he did or not. I mean, I would have expected him to have spoken to them, but I don't know.
All right, thank you.
Is that a convenient moment now?
Yes, it is. Right, well, we'll take the break for the afternoon at that point. We'll stop there. We'll come back at 20 to 4, and as before, please don't discuss your evidence with anyone. All right, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Millett. 20 to 4, please. Would you ask Dame Melanie to come back in, please? All right, on we go. Yes, thank you.
Yes.
Yes, Mr.
Yes, can we please next go to CLG 408750? And this is a letter. It will... No, it is an email. And if you look, please, at the top, it's an email sent from Louise Morgan to Sajid Javid's office. And the important point is the attachment, PPS GT letter, in case you want to pick. And if we look at the letter, we can see that it is at CLG 405363. Yes. And it's a letter addressed to Robert and John. The John is Baradell. And it comes from Kenny Bowie, who is PPS to the Home Secretary. And it refers to an official visit to the Westway conducted by the Home Secretary and Nick Hurd, MP. Now, just looking at the front page, it's dated the 17th of June 2017, so the Saturday. Were you aware of this letter? Did you see it at the time?
No, I've not seen it before.
You've never seen it before? You've never seen it before now?
No.
Right. In which case, I think there's nothing I need to ask you about it. But were you aware at the time of problems at the Westway?
Yes.
And can you tell us what kind of problems you were aware of?
So what I was hearing was, it's a little bit difficult, to be honest, having read so much about it since, to know what I knew then and what I know now. But
yes.
What I was hearing at the time was that it was badly organised, that it wasn't clear who was from the council, that it just wasn't well set up, and didn't provide the kind of private spaces that you would have expected for people to have quite difficult and traumatic conversations about what they needed, that people didn't feel they had access to local services that was clear, or indeed to central government services. So just that it wasn't set up properly and wasn't proving to be supportive to people.
Did you get the... did you hear that there had been a feeling that people in hotels were out of sight, out of mind, and had been ignored by the council, having been put in hotels? Was that something that came through to you?
I certainly remember, particularly as we went into the following week, that people in hotels felt that they hadn't had any contact from the council, and that they weren't quite sure who to go to for support.
And did that improve at any point?
I remember it being a problem for quite some time, and I also remember some weeks after the fire there being an issue with people's with the deal that had been struck with the hotel for them to stay in those rooms suddenly coming to an end, and there being uncertainty about whether they were able to stay. So the question of the hotels and whether they were really working for the families, and the fact that they weren't working for many of the families, was an issue for some time.
Now, let's turn to a different topic, perhaps scrolling back in time a little bit to the Friday, the 16th of June, and that's the Victim Support Unit. Can we start with your first statement, please, paragraph 66 at page 21? And if we look at the penultimate bullet point on that page, it says, to form a new integrated support service for Grenfell victims. And that was what had been agreed at the Grenfell Recovery Task Force meeting at 1:30 on that day. Yes?
Yes.
So let's read it together. To form a new integrated support service for the Grenfell victims, providing a single point of access intra-central government services for those who needed it. This action was assigned to Gillian Kay following a discussion with the Home Office about which department should take charge. By the end of the day, a 20-strong team of operational staff from HMRC had been identified to form a new victims unit led by Suzanne Kochanovsky, and arrangements had been made for them to start their work on Saturday morning. Is it right that Gillian Kay and Suzanne Kochanovsky in the event did lead on that initiative?
Yes, and indeed they led the victims unit for several years between them.
Right. And now Gillian Kay in her statement, page 9, paragraph 38, says that they had a meeting with the Civil Contingency Secretariat to discuss that initiative at 5 o'clock in the evening of the 16th of June. Is that something you know about?
Yes, I'm aware that that took place.
Right. You weren't there?
No.
Right. Now, did you know that at the meeting it was agreed that the Victims Unit would be a single integrated service modelled on the Victims of Terrorism Unit?
Yes.
Yes. And would provide a single point of contact to enable those affected by a major incident to access government services directly?
Yes.
And is it right also that there were representatives from the Victims of Terrorism Unit on the call or at the meeting to explain how it worked?
Yes.
And then I think HMRC provided 20 members of staff as part of their surge team.
Yes.
I think that's how it was staffed, was it?
That's right. Initially, on
Right.
Saturday morning, they arrived.
Right. And why HMRC?
Well, some years earlier, surge arrangements had been put in place in the civil service in order to support departments who had a sudden need for administrative staff that they couldn't cater for. And HMRC have a lot of administrative staff, and the sort of flexibility that can allow them to support events for weeks or days. And this was felt to be something that they could help with. So this was a cross civil service resource that was being mobilised by HMRC.
I see. Now, can we go to CLG 3030529? This is a paper drafted, I think, by Gillian Kay, as she says in her statement, about the scope and the purpose of the Victims Support Unit, or Victims Unit, Grenfell Tower. And it says that the unit would be, as it says, quoting from paragraph 1, a single integrated support service following the model of the Victims of Terrorism Unit to coordinate cross-government activity and provide those affected by the Grenfell Tower fire with a single point of access into central government. And then it goes on with some details. Did you have any input into this paper?
No.
Did you see it at the time?
Don't think so, no.
And if we go to paragraph 5, you can see the objectives under the heading Terms of Reference. And there are 3 of them. Ensure effective, comprehensive and coordinated HMG support to victims of the Grenfell Tower fire. Engender public confidence, including key interested parties in HMG support for victims. Ensure effective working alongside local authority and third sector response. And then under key deliverables, it says, a single point of access to HMG support through a dedicated phone line, victim-centred caseworking team with access to expertise from key government departments, DWP, Home Office, DFE, MOJ, HMRC and DH. Was this as you understood it? In other words, the objectives and the key deliverables?
Yes, I think on the Friday afternoon there wasn't complete clarity about exactly how it would work, and in the end there were layers of support that were provided, is the way I would describe it. There was a decision taken by Gold Command, I think on Sunday, that they needed caseworkers as part of Gold for all of the families and those affected. And so at that point, I think it became clearer that the central government victim support should be via those caseworkers rather than direct to families, is my understanding. And that seems to me quite sensible. But everyone was piecing together the different pieces of the jigsaw on Saturday and Sunday. The other layer that was put in was that departments were also asked by the Cabinet Office, I understand, to send people directly to the Westway, which they did, I believe, from Monday.
Yes.
So actually they were able to field quite a lot of the inquiries directly themselves. I'm not sure that worked terribly well for the first few days, but they did actually field quite a few inquiries. So there was less need in the end for the victim support unit with the HMRC volunteers.
Well, I think you cut perhaps to the chase with that. I was leading up more gently to it. But in the end, I think it's right, isn't there, that there wasn't, first of all, a specific practiced emergency plan in setting up a victims support unit. You had to borrow from the terrorist experience.
Yes, that's right.
Yes. And I think it's also right that the usefulness of the unit became eroded into something of a sweeper function, according to some of the later emails. Yes? Is that how you understood it?
I'm not sure I've described it as a sweeper function, but it was for, I think they were able to field some inquiries, particularly where they couldn't be resolved easily on the ground and somebody needed to go back into the department and liaise. But I agree with you, I don't think there was a clear plan, and it's not clear to me which department should have been responsible for holding that preparation either, because this was in the end a Home Office unit from which, as you say, we borrowed. And I think, to be honest, that was very effective that meeting was called so quickly on Friday afternoon so that the learning could be had and they could discuss what worked. But in an ideal world, you would have a bit more of a menu of different options that was pre-prepared, and then you could think about what was going to be useful in the circumstances.
Yes. Do you also recall that there was a confusion among departments and agencies about what the victim support unit would do and what the Red Cross phone line would do? Do you remember that?
I don't particularly remember the confusion with the Red Cross, no. I remember the confusion between the victims unit and the people at the Westway.
Right. Let's go then to DC. Let's go to CLG 3020610. Just to pick up on that point. This is an internal DCLG email of the 18th of June at 15:11, 3:11, from. I know it's impossible to find it, but it is from the office of Sajid Javid to his own office, copied to lots of people, including Alok Sharma's office, your office, Red, and others. And it says in the first bold in yellow, first and foremost, SOFS said a huge thank you to all those involved in this effort. He's incredibly grateful for all the work being done in the department. And then if you go to page 2, please, the particular point to pick up at page 2 is on is in the third paragraph down, on the ground support. Secretary of State wants there to be better coordination, e.g. one number for people on the ground to phone for support. Catherine M. advises that Red Cross is providing this service. Gold Command will be announcing this today. Action, please can SFS get an update on this? The question I have is this. Was the Red Cross, first of all, providing that service, a phone line service?
I believe they were, but that was a decision that was for Gold Command, and I believe they were, yes. I think there was some confusion about the phone number as well, but
right.
But this was evolving, and if I can just comment on this, I think you can see here that I think the Secretary of State and the Prime Minister and others were very keen for there to be civil service visible support on the ground with tabards and lanyards and so on. And those who were experienced in emergency response, including John Barradell and others, and also Joe Farrer, were very clear that that would not be a very good idea, that civil servants don't really have the expertise to engage directly with people in these sorts of circumstances, that they could easily get things wrong, and they simply weren't trained to do it. And that instead, making sure the administrative support was there behind the scenes to respond to events, ideally through a caseworker system, which wasn't in place until early in the following week, that was the right solution. But we were muddling through a bit during these days, I think, with some difference in what ministers wanted to happen and what I think in the end turned out to be exactly the right thing to happen. So you can see that, I can see that in this email, that tension that we eventually worked through. But I think that, more advanced preparation would have made it easier for ministers to make choices and understand exactly what it was that they were choosing.
Yes. Yes, thank you. Now, finally, on the question of the victim support unit, I think you would agree that in the end, the unit provided very little benefit to the overall response.
I don't know. I'm not sure what it did in the rest of that following week because I haven't looked at any of the documents beyond the Tuesday on this. That's Tuesday the 20th. But in the end, it seems to me that quite a lot of the inquiries that people had were resolved relatively straightforwardly. There were things like driving licences and so on. Some of the issues around benefits and immigration status and so on took longer, but again, needed more specialist support that a more generic victims unit wasn't really able to help with anyway. So yes, I'm not sure it turned out to be quite the right fit, but I would say in a crisis like this, better to start and to try and to have a go and then adapt it as you go along than to spend a really long time working out a perfect solution that then isn't implemented. So, Suzanne and Gillian had a go, put something in place, and then it needed to be adapted.
Can I then turn to changes since the fire? And to pick this up at page 37 of your first statement, paragraph 122. Did you say there, since the fire, improvements have been made to London local government resilience arrangements following a peer challenge which reported in early 2018. This recommended that London Council strengthen the Gold Command resolution to, quote, make triggers and the escalation process clearer so that there is a clear mandated process in the extreme circumstances that demand it, close quotation marks. This greater transparency of process and expectation seems to me to be a key conclusion in the light of Grenfell. An important role for central government is to work with and support all local areas to ensure that these arrangements are in place. What were the improvements made to the London local government resilience arrangements that are referred to here by you following the Grenfell Tower fire?
They are the ones that were set out in the report by Tom Reardon and Mary Ney. My understanding is that the key thing was to improve the trigger through which wider resilience support is provided to an individual council and to reduce the reliance on the council themselves asking for help. But I'll be honest with you, I looked back at that report as part of my preparations for this hearing, and I couldn't quite myself see the clarity of recommendation. But that's my understanding of what's been done.
Yeah, indeed. What I wanted just to ask you about with a little bit more focus is when you say this greater transparency of process and expectation seems to me to be a key conclusion in the light of Grenfell. What did you mean by that?
Well, I think the key problem on the Wednesday morning is that the council didn't seek to mobilise the support it could have had from other boroughs across London through the London Resilience arrangements. And so that, for me, raises questions of process and expectation and trigger points and decision points. And I don't quite know what the right answer is here. I think it's very difficult because of what I say in the end of the previous paragraph, actually, that you don't want central government or indeed really anyone else to cut across local command structures. But when those structures are not working, you have to know who acts, the basis on which they act, the information they gather in order to act, and whose responsibility it is to check. So that's the piece that was missing. And I think it was left to the council alone. We were all relying on that. It didn't happen. And we were all, and not just central government or DCLG, by the way, I think also London Resilience need to understand, what they could have done more. They didn't ring us either on that Wednesday and Thursday. So I feel that there is a collective sense in which somehow the system needs to mobilise to act in a situation like that didn't happen after Grenfell. But I don't think this is straightforward, because you could go in and be too overbearing of a council that was actually doing a good job, and that could create problems.
Well, I was going to ask you, is it your understanding that the improvements to which you refer in paragraph 122 do give someone some overriding power to act without the consent of the local authority?
I'm not sure they do go that far, not to act without the consent. And indeed, there was consent by the local authority for the arrangements that were put in place after Grenfell. No.
Right, thank you.
But whether you need something without their consent, or whether in the end enough pressure can be put to bear, amongst officers and elected councillors together for them to realise they need to do something differently. That was, in the end, it was enough here, but will it always be enough?
Now, in that last answer, but one, you referred to London Resilience needing to understand that they could have done more. To whom are you referring when you say London Resilience?
Well, I mean the London Gold arrangement. So I'm sorry, my recollection of this is a bit rusty anyway. But what could have happened on the day is that a rotating gold structure could have been put in place, and the individuals, ironically, were actually there supporting Nicholas Holgate. It's just that they weren't operating in that way. And that system of a rotating set of chief executives actually leading gold, the system was there, and indeed some of the capabilities, such as humanitarian support, were there and quite well rehearsed, and they weren't called upon.
So you mean the duty golds?
The duty golds, yes.
I follow.
That's what I mean.
Thank you. Dame Melanie, you'll be pleased to know that I've come to the end of my questions that I wanted to ask you, but there may be others that I haven't, which are in my notes, and there may be others which others think I should ask you. So what I'm going to do is ask the chairman to take the usual break at this stage and see if there are such questions.
Yes, well, as you know from your previous experience with us, we have a break at this stage to see whether there are more questions we ought to ask you. So we'll stop now. Do you think 10 minutes is enough, Mr. Willett?
I do.
Well, if I say 10 past, then you can always tell us if you need more time.
That would be helpful. Thank you.
We'll say 10 past 4. It might be a bit longer, but we'll try and get you back as soon as we can. All right? Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Willett. 10 past 4, unless you tell us that you need more time.
Thank you very much, Mr.
Thank you very much. Would you ask Dame Melanie to come back in, please? Right, well, we'll see if there are any more questions. Yes, Mr. Billett.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Just one or two. Now, you told us this morning that you, I think, have had a past experience that local authorities had, as you say, been pretty good at dealing with temporary crises. That was your experience. Now, can I show you a document? HOM 42998, please. HOM 42998. This is a document entitled Civil Contingencies, Role of the Local Tier. You see that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Is it a document you've ever seen before?
I don't believe so, no. But I can see that it's dated January 2015.
Yes. And
So just
therefore,
before I came to DCLG, so I may not have seen it when I arrived.
It is. And is it, if you go to page 2 and look at C on page 2, it says, changes to service models, whether through budget pressures or policy decisions, may also lead to reduced resilience of specific services, which may also become a burden for government. For example, provision of home-based social care through private providers, etc. And then D, a reduction in local authority and responder organisation resilience and emergency capacity may create significant additional financial costs for the government. For example, local emergencies are likely to trigger the overwhelmed subsidiarity criteria, prompting central government intervention sooner, causing a greater proportion of the costs of responding to local emergencies to be transferred to central government. Is that something that you were aware of when you came in to the department?
I was certainly aware of the reduction in local authority resourcing. I think it was about 25% in real terms over the preceding 5 years before I arrived, and that had had an impact, no question. I wasn't aware of this particular document pointing to the risks that could create for resilience and emergency capacity.
And if you go, please, to page 4, there's a question at the top. Is the current model fit for purpose out to 2020? And beneath that is a spider's web, perhaps unsurprisingly, of what it's supposed to look like. And it's a figure illustrating the decline, it is said, in local tier emergency planning and response that will take place if the current model is not adapted. And it goes on to say, out to 2020, the current model may not be fit for purpose, and a failure to adapt to the 2020 context may degrade the ability of the local tier to conduct emergency planning and response. This model can continue to be relied upon to deliver outputs, but the additional risk that will be accepted as a result must be articulated and understood. Is that a problem or a question or topic which you were aware of at any time after January 2015, and particularly when you joined the department in 2016?
No, I wasn't. And I wasn't aware of this document. I think it's a very interesting document. Of course, we didn't have any role in DCLG in overseeing whether or not that local resilience and emergencies planning was actually adequate. We didn't have an assurance role, and I think that's changed. I think it was a gap in the system. But you know, I can see here being identified quite a lot of potential risks.
When you say we didn't have an assurance role, do you mean DCLG?
DCLG didn't, no. Through RED is what I mean.
I see.
Yeah.
But central government did through the Cabinet Office or the CCS, or is that not right?
I don't believe that they had a role or that anyone had a role from central government in assuring individual plans and making sure that they were adequate. That's what I meant when I said assurance.
But did anyone in central government have some kind of assurance role or oversight role about the structure and fitness for purpose of the contingency framework, the national contingency framework?
Of the national contingency framework, that would have been the Cabinet Office.
Yes, thank you. Well, that's thank you very much for that. So that leads me to one final question, which is a question I know you've been asked before, in a different context, in a different module, but it's this. Looking back on the events of the period immediately following the Grenfell Tower fire, on and from the 14th of June 2017, and looking in particular at all the material, the disparate range of material we've covered during the course of your evidence today, and your own particular role, is there anything, looking back on it, that you would have done differently?
Well, I'd just like to say I just deeply regret the fact that, families, residents and a local community who had experienced such a devastating fire and the impact of that then did not get the support that they needed and should have did deserve straight after the fire. And I think the mistakes that were made in the way that the response was organised, and particularly the way the humanitarian response was available in the first hours after the fire, took too long for us all to realise. And then once we had realised that the problems were there, it inevitably, I think, took quite a long time to sort out and correct through the Gold Command structures. So when I look back and think about what we could have done differently, as I've said a number of times today, I wish that Joe Farrow and I in particular had thought to check that the London Gold arrangements were there and that they were operating in the way that I think it was obvious was going to be needed at the beginning, and that we just assumed were there. And I wish we'd checked that, because that might have had an impact in accelerating the improvement that came later, but too late. So that's my first reflection. But I would like to say that I do believe it's incredibly important that the principle of a locally led response is preserved here. When I read all the witness statements, and particularly those from Rugby Portobello and the Clement Danes Centre, I was just struck once again about how local relationships and understanding of the community need to be very, very central. And it was the failure to brigade those that is such a shame, because it was there. And actually was effective, but just was never quite harnessed and led and used by the council in the way that it could have been. So I do believe locally led responses are right, and I think central government should be very, very careful about stepping in to things it doesn't have the experience of or really know how to sort out. My second reflection is one we touched on this morning. I don't think that the distinction between response and recovery, and the planning in particular for recovery, helped us in the response to Grenfell Tower. The Home Office was the lead government department, but I think we assumed that mantle very quickly from DCLG for response and recovery. I think the distinction between the response and recovery issues wasn't really there. It was just a question of time. I feel that if we had done more preparation as a department, but actually also if it had been clearer in the way that the central government systems and decisions operated, that we would have been put in that place more obviously, more quickly, I think we could have improved the way that we gripped all this. And in addition, I still stand by the comment I made in my first witness statement that I think a cabinet level meeting on that first day would also have accelerated the sense of urgency and grip and everybody coming together that was achieved later in the week. So I think there are a number of reflections there really for the overall resilience and emergency planning structures and the way that they're organised and the roles of departments that I think we were sort of working around to the best of our ability, but slightly with one arm behind our back. And then my final reflection is that I think, and again, I think this is something for the Cabinet Office to lead, I think it would help central government to be clearer about the offers that it makes in scenarios like this, to be clearer about the types of victim support that can be useful in different scenarios, to map more comprehensively the sorts of things that central government departments might or might not be asked to do, so that there is a clearer sense of what is available to ministers, which I think would speed up their decisions. As I was saying just before the last break, I think there was some confusion about what the victims unit was, what ministers had asked for, what ultimately was appropriate to deliver. And again, I think those things slowed us down and were confusing. I think it was irritating and confusing for ministers, and I think it was quite hard for officials to act on things in that slight vacuum of understanding of what is there to be done. So I think the Cabinet Office has actually done quite a lot of work on this. They did a big review in the autumn of 2017, but I'm not clear myself exactly what was actioned. And those are the two things that I would particularly flag that I think could be deserving of further investigation.
Well, Dame Melanie, thank you very much for that answer, and indeed for all of your evidence. We're extremely grateful to you for coming here to the inquiry for the second time and assisting us with our investigations. So it only remains for me to say thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And it also remains, of course, for me to thank you very much on behalf of the panel. There aren't all that many people who've come more than once to give evidence to the inquiry, and we're particularly grateful to you for giving up the time to come for a second time. I need hardly say that we've learned a lot from hearing your evidence, and we're very grateful to you for being here. So thank you very much. And of course, you're now free to go.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Millett. No.
That concludes the oral evidence for this module.
Yes.
There are further witness statements which we need to read into the inquiry's record.
Yes.
Those are to be found in two parts. There are first IDX 0933, which is the reference under which the witness statements from government and other like organisations will be found, including RBKC. There is a second and separate Module 4 list, which is the BSR statements, and those are to be found compendiously under IDX 0932. There are large numbers of statements in both groups, and each of them has their own IWS number or number, CAB or RBK, as the case may be, and they can be read there. So they are to be taken now as in the record and publicly available.
Thank you very much.
And Mr. Chairman, that brings us then formally to the end of the factual evidence indeed all the evidence for Module 4.
Thank you. Well, at that point, we shall break off the hearings. We are not going to sit next week, so there will be no hearings next week, but on the 6th of June, we shall embark on Module 7, and Module 7 will involve hearing expert evidence from a variety of witnesses relating to matters that have already been touched on in the course of the inquiry, but on which we have not had the benefit of their views yet.
That's right.
So we adjourn now, and we resume at 10 o'clock on the 6th of June.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much.
Panel.